At 2:20 in the morning, the lights disappeared before the legend was born. For just a few moments, the North Atlantic became strangely quiet. The largest passenger liner in the world, a ship carrying more than 2,000 people across an ocean that had promised speed, luxury, and confidence, slipped beneath the surface and left almost nothing behind except scattered lifeboats, floating debris, and questions that would outlive everyone who witnessed that night. More than a century later, nearly everyone believes they already know what happened. Titanic struck an iceberg. The ship sank. Too few lifeboats were available. The disaster changed maritime history forever. That version is familiar because it is true, at least in part. But history rarely fits inside a single sentence. The closer investigators have looked at the events of April 14 and April 15, 1912, the more complicated the story has become. This was not simply the story of a collision at sea. It was the story of dozens of decisions made by different people, under different pressures, each one appearing reasonable in isolation, yet together forming a chain of events that no one aboard fully understood until it was too late. In many ways, the sinking of Titanic did not begin when steel met ice. It began hours earlier, perhaps even years earlier, in design offices, government regulations, shipping traditions, and the extraordinary confidence of an era that believed technology had finally mastered nature. Yet none of the people standing on Titanic's decks that evening could see that chain unfolding around them. To most passengers, it was simply another peaceful Sunday night. The sea appeared unusually calm, almost like polished glass stretching toward a horizon hidden by darkness. The engines continued their steady rhythm beneath the decks. Conversations drifted through elegant dining rooms and lounges. Some passengers read books before retiring for the night. Others lingered in conversation, enjoying what seemed like another ordinary evening aboard the newest symbol of modern engineering. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested that history was only hours away from changing forever. That contrast is one of the reasons Titanic continues to fascinate people across generations. Disasters usually announce themselves with warning signs that become obvious in hindsight. Titanic is different. Many of the people on board experienced the first moments of the disaster not as terror, but as uncertainty. They did not immediately recognize that the future had already changed. Even after the collision, some passengers barely noticed anything unusual at all. Others felt only a slight vibration, almost as if the ship had passed over rough water. Few imagined they were standing aboard a vessel that would soon vanish beneath the Atlantic. That gap between what was happening and what people believed was happening lies at the heart of this investigation. We are not here to repeat a familiar legend or search for a dramatic twist hidden inside an old tragedy. Instead, we will follow the evidence as carefully as possible, separating documented facts from later assumptions, eyewitness testimony from historical reconstruction, and certainty from speculation. Because when we strip away decades of mythology, one question still remains surprisingly difficult to answer. If the collision itself did not immediately doom everyone on board, then what actually transformed an accident into one of history's greatest maritime disasters? To answer that, we have to return to the hours before anyone ever saw the iceberg, when the most important warnings of the night were already quietly making their way across the cold Atlantic air. Hours before anyone on board realized that history was moving toward them, the evening looked almost ordinary. The dining rooms had emptied, conversations had drifted into quiet lounges, and many passengers had already retired to their cabins. Crew members continued their routines with the calm precision expected aboard one of the finest passenger liners ever built. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested urgency. If someone had walked from one end of the ship to the other shortly before midnight, they would have found a vessel that appeared confident, organized, and completely in control. That impression, however, only existed from the perspective of those enjoying the voyage. Beyond the glow of the ship's lights, the North Atlantic was telling a different story. Earlier that day, other vessels traveling through the region had encountered unusually heavy ice. Some reported large fields of floating ice. Others described massive icebergs drifting farther south than many sailors expected for that time of year. These observations were not unusual enough to stop ocean travel altogether, but they were important enough to be transmitted by wireless radio to nearby ships. One after another, those messages crossed the Atlantic airwaves, carrying practical information meant to help captains navigate safely through changing conditions. Several of those warnings reached the ship. This detail often surprises people because it challenges one of the simplest versions of the story. It was not a case of sailing blindly into unknown danger. Information about ice did exist. The more difficult question is how that information was handled inside a complex system where dozens of messages flowed through the wireless room every day. At the beginning of the 20th century, wireless communication was still a remarkable technology. It connected ships across vast stretches of open ocean, but it also served commercial purposes. Passengers paid to send personal messages to family and friends on shore. Maintaining that service was an important responsibility for the wireless operators, who often worked long hours managing a constant stream of traffic. Ice warnings shared the same communication channels as routine transmissions, creating an environment where every incoming message had to be received, recorded, prioritized, and delivered. Some navigational reports were passed directly to the bridge. Others were acknowledged and filed. Understanding exactly which messages reached which officers, and when they were reviewed, has remained one of the most closely examined parts of the investigation for more than a century. What becomes clear from surviving records is not a picture of complete negligence, but something far more familiar. Information moved through people, and people worked within systems that depended on judgment, timing, and experience. Every decision seemed reasonable within the moment it was made. No one could yet see how those individual choices would eventually connect. Meanwhile, conditions outside the ship were becoming increasingly deceptive. The sea was exceptionally calm, with very little wind disturbing the surface. Under normal circumstances, waves breaking against the base of an iceberg often created white water that made the ice easier to detect from a distance. On this night, that natural warning was greatly reduced. The air itself remained remarkably clear, allowing distant stars to shine brightly above the dark horizon. To many observers, the weather seemed almost perfect. Yet the same calm conditions that made the night appear peaceful also removed visual clues that experienced sailors often relied upon. The ocean had become quieter, but not safer. Long before anyone spotted a wall of ice ahead, the stage had already been set by a combination of environmental conditions, advancing technology, routine human judgment, and a confidence shared by nearly everyone on board. The collision, when it finally came, would last only moments. Understanding why those moments mattered requires looking even closer at what happened when the first warning from the lookout finally broke the silence. The warning did not arrive as a dramatic interruption. It came as a simple observation from two lookouts stationed high above the decks inside the crow's nest. They had spent hours scanning an ocean that revealed almost nothing beyond the reach of the ship's lights. There were no powerful searchlights to sweep across the water. Instead, they relied on their eyesight, experience, and the faint contrast between the horizon and anything that did not belong there. Shortly before midnight, one of those faint shapes finally emerged from the darkness. It was not illuminated by moonlight because there was no moon. It did not announce itself with crashing waves because the sea was unusually calm. It simply appeared, almost blending into the night until there was no longer any doubt. The telephone connecting the crow's nest to the bridge came alive with a brief and urgent report. "Iceberg, right ahead." Those few words triggered a sequence of actions that investigators have reconstructed for more than 100 years. Officers on the bridge reacted immediately. Orders were issued to alter course in an attempt to avoid a direct collision. Commands were also given regarding the engines. Historians continue to examine the precise timing of every order because surviving testimony differs in small but important ways. Human memory, especially under extraordinary circumstances, rarely preserves every second with perfect accuracy. What remains consistent across the available evidence is that the crew responded within an extremely limited window of time. Estimates vary slightly, but the interval between spotting the iceberg and reaching it was measured in seconds, not minutes. Modern simulations have demonstrated just how little opportunity existed to reverse the momentum of a vessel more than 800 feet long and weighing over 50,000 tons. Even under ideal conditions, such a ship could not simply stop or turn instantly. Momentum obeyed the laws of physics rather than human urgency. The object ahead continued to grow larger as the ship closed the remaining distance. Then came the contact itself. Contrary to popular imagination, many people on board did not experience a violent impact. Several survivors later described little more than a subtle vibration or a gentle shudder passing through the structure. Some barely interrupted their conversations. Others noticed dishes rattling or felt an unfamiliar motion beneath their feet. A few passengers looked outside, expecting to see the reason for the disturbance, only to find the same dark ocean stretching into the distance. From their perspective, nothing appeared seriously wrong. Yet below the waterline, where no passenger could witness what had happened, the situation was entirely different. The iceberg had not needed to tear open one enormous hole to place the ship in danger. Investigations conducted decades later, supported by engineering studies and examinations of the wreck itself, suggest a more complex picture. The contact affected multiple sections of the hull across a considerable length, allowing seawater to enter several forward compartments. Each individual opening may have been relatively limited, but together they crossed a threshold that the ship's designers had never intended the vessel to survive. That distinction matters because it changes the way we understand the disaster. The danger was not immediately obvious, even to experienced people on board. A ship could absorb certain types of damage and remain afloat. The question facing the officers was whether this particular damage exceeded those carefully calculated limits. At first, no passenger could answer that question. In fact, very few even knew it needed to be asked. Above deck, the night remained strangely calm. The engines had stopped, but there was no visible panic. The stars still reflected across the dark Atlantic, and the ship remained upright enough to reassure those who believed they had simply experienced an inconvenience. Beneath that calm exterior, however, inspections were already revealing information that would quietly transform uncertainty into a grim realization. Within a remarkably short time, those responsible for evaluating the damage would reach a conclusion that almost no one else aboard was prepared to hear. The first inspection did not happen in a room filled with panic. It happened through observation, measurement, and experience. Shortly after the collision, senior officers and the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, began assessing the areas where seawater had entered the forward sections of the vessel. Crew members reported flooding in multiple compartments, information that at first sounded manageable. After all, the ship had been designed with a system of watertight compartments intended to keep it afloat even after suffering significant damage. That feature had become one of the defining symbols of its engineering. Many passengers had heard about it before the voyage even began, and it contributed to the widespread belief that the ship represented a new standard of safety at sea. But engineering always depends on assumptions. The design could tolerate flooding in a limited number of compartments because the watertight bulkheads would contain the incoming water and prevent it from spreading farther through the hull. The problem facing the inspection team was not simply that water had entered the ship. The problem was how many compartments had already been breached. As reports continued arriving from below, a troubling pattern emerged. Water was entering more forward compartments than the design had been intended to survive. Individually, none of those compartments guaranteed disaster. Together, they created a sequence that changed everything. As the bow settled lower into the Atlantic, seawater would eventually rise high enough to spill over the tops of the watertight bulkheads into the next compartment behind them. Those barriers were effective only up to a certain height. They had never been designed to seal the ship completely from deck to deck. In normal circumstances, that limitation posed little concern because no one expected so many adjacent compartments to flood at the same time. Yet that night, the assumptions behind the design encountered conditions beyond their intended limits. This realization marked one of the most important turning points of the entire disaster. The collision itself had lasted only moments, but the consequences were now unfolding according to the laws of buoyancy rather than human decision. Once enough water entered the forward part of the ship, gravity would continue the process. The lower the bow settled, the more easily seawater could move into additional spaces. Modern engineering studies have often described this as a progressive flooding sequence, a chain reaction that became increasingly difficult to interrupt once it had begun. Investigators examining the wreck decades later found evidence broadly consistent with this understanding. Rather than revealing one enormous opening torn through the hull, the evidence pointed toward damage distributed across several areas, enough to compromise multiple compartments without producing the dramatic rupture imagined by popular culture. That distinction explains why so many people on board underestimated the seriousness of the situation. The ship did not immediately appear crippled. It remained remarkably stable during the early stages of flooding. Electric lights continued illuminating hallways and public rooms. The deck still felt steady beneath the feet of most passengers. Conversations continued. Some people even returned to their cabins after briefly stepping outside to see what had happened. From a distance, almost nothing suggested that the vessel had already crossed a point from which recovery was impossible. For Thomas Andrews, however, the calculations painted a very different picture. Based on the reports available to him, he concluded that the ship would not remain afloat indefinitely. Estimates of the remaining time varied, but the essential conclusion remained the same. The vessel was going to sink. That knowledge existed within a very small circle while thousands of people around them continued experiencing what seemed like an unusual but controlled interruption to their voyage. The greatest challenge had quietly shifted. It was no longer about determining whether the ship could be saved. It was about preparing hundreds of people for a reality that still contradicted everything they could see with their own eyes. For the people responsible for operating the ship, the next challenge was no longer technical. It was human. Knowing that the vessel could not remain afloat was one thing. Convincing thousands of passengers to leave a brightly lit ship in the middle of a cold, dark ocean was something entirely different. Looking back with the benefit of history, it is easy to assume that everyone would have rushed immediately toward the lifeboats. The historical record tells a far more complicated story. Many passengers simply did not believe the situation was truly dangerous. From where they stood, the ship remained remarkably stable. There were no dramatic sounds echoing across the decks, no sudden list that made it difficult to walk, and no obvious visual evidence that the enormous vessel beneath their feet had already begun losing the battle against the sea. Some passengers asked whether the interruption was merely precautionary. Others hesitated to leave the warmth and apparent safety of the ship for small wooden boats suspended above freezing water. Their hesitation was understandable. Every instinct suggested that remaining aboard a massive ocean liner was safer than climbing into a lifeboat that appeared fragile by comparison. Crew members now faced an almost impossible communication problem. They needed people to act before those people fully understood why action was necessary. Survivors later recalled that many instructions were delivered calmly rather than dramatically, an approach intended to prevent unnecessary panic but one that may also have reinforced the impression that the situation remained under control. Officers supervised the uncovering and preparation of the lifeboats while stewards moved through passageways encouraging passengers to come on deck with life jackets. For many, the request sounded temporary, almost routine. Some returned briefly to their cabins for warmer clothing or personal belongings, believing they would soon return. Others paused to ask questions that no one could answer with complete certainty. How serious was the damage? Would another ship arrive soon? Was this simply a precaution? Those questions reflected the information available at the time, not the complete picture historians possess today. The lifeboats themselves became another source of hesitation. Modern audiences often focus on the fact that there were not enough seats for everyone aboard, and that reality undeniably shaped the outcome of the disaster. Yet during the earliest launches, another problem emerged. Several boats left the ship carrying significantly fewer people than they were capable of holding. This was not because empty seats were considered acceptable, but because officers had to balance multiple uncertainties at once. Some questioned how much weight the boats could safely support while being lowered. Others expected they would return repeatedly to collect additional passengers once the ship stabilized or rescue arrived. Those assumptions reflected the limited information available during the first stage of the evacuation. As conditions gradually changed, those expectations also changed, but valuable time had already passed. Human behavior during emergencies rarely follows a simple pattern. People seek familiar routines, trusted authority, and visible confirmation before accepting extraordinary claims. On that night, nearly every visual signal suggested stability while the hidden engineering reality pointed toward irreversible decline. That gap between appearance and reality delayed countless individual decisions, each understandable on its own, yet collectively significant. Investigators studying survivor testimony have long recognized that memory preserves emotion more vividly than precise timing, but across many different accounts one theme appears again and again. Few people immediately grasped that every passing minute reduced the number of choices still available. While passengers continued deciding whether to leave the apparent security of the ship, another race had already begun beyond the edge of the visible horizon. Messages requesting immediate assistance were now traveling outward through the darkness, carrying the hope that somewhere beyond the silent Atlantic, another vessel would hear them in time. As wireless operators continued transmitting distress calls into the darkness, the fate of everyone aboard increasingly depended on people they could not see. Every signal carried the same urgent purpose. A ship was in trouble. Immediate assistance was needed. The technology that had seemed so remarkable only hours earlier now became the most important connection between an isolated vessel and the outside world. Unlike previous generations of sailors, they could ask for help across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Whether that help could arrive in time was another question entirely. Several ships received the calls and responded according to their own circumstances. Among them was Carpathia, whose wireless operator recognized the seriousness of the situation and alerted Captain Arthur Rostron. Almost immediately, Rostron ordered his ship to change course and proceed at the highest speed he believed could be maintained safely through the same dangerous waters. Crew members prepared blankets, medical supplies, hot drinks, and every available space that might be needed for survivors. It was an extraordinary effort, but geography imposed limits that determination alone could not overcome. Carpathia was dozens of miles away. Even moving as quickly as conditions allowed, it could not arrive within minutes. Time had become the one resource no one could replace. Another vessel, Californian, has remained at the center of historical debate for more than a century. Evidence confirms that Californian was much closer than Carpathia. It had stopped for the night because its crew believed continuing through heavy ice and darkness presented unnecessary risk. What happened next has been examined by investigators, historians, and maritime experts ever since. Crew members aboard Californian observed lights in the distance and noticed rockets rising into the night sky. The meaning of those signals, however, was not immediately understood. Testimony collected during official inquiries revealed conflicting memories about what officers believed they were seeing, when they saw it, and whether the unidentified ship appeared to be moving or standing still. Historians continue to debate individual decisions made aboard Californian, but the surviving evidence does not support reducing the entire tragedy to a single moment or a single person. Instead, it reveals another example of how uncertainty shaped nearly every choice that night. Rockets at sea could serve different purposes depending on the situation, and without complete information, observers interpreted events through the limited context available to them. Meanwhile, aboard the damaged liner, time continued slipping away. The bow settled lower with each passing minute, making the seriousness of the situation increasingly visible even to passengers who had doubted the earlier warnings. Lifeboats continued leaving the ship, but the opportunity to organize a more orderly evacuation steadily diminished. Every launch represented both hope for those aboard the boat and a reminder that fewer options remained for everyone still waiting. The contrast between the different ships on the Atlantic that night is striking. One raced through darkness toward an uncertain destination. Another remained stationary, uncertain about what it was witnessing. The vessel at the center of the emergency struggled against a process that engineering calculations had already declared irreversible. None of these crews possessed the complete picture that historians can assemble today by comparing radio logs, survivor testimony, official investigations, and later research. Each acted according to the information available within a narrow window of time. That perspective is essential because it reminds us that history is rarely experienced with perfect clarity by the people living through it. As the distance between rescue and disaster slowly narrowed, another realization was emerging from the evidence. The catastrophe could no longer be explained by an iceberg alone, or by a single decision made in a single moment. A much larger pattern was beginning to reveal itself, one in which nature, technology, engineering, communication, and human judgment had all become inseparably connected. By the time the final lifeboats were leaving, the disaster could no longer be explained by a single mistake or a single moment. The evidence gathered over more than a century points instead toward something far more complex. The iceberg was the event that began the emergency, but it was not the complete explanation for what followed. Every major investigation has returned to the same fundamental question. Why did this particular collision produce such extraordinary consequences? One answer focuses on the environment itself. The North Atlantic presented an unusually deceptive combination of conditions. The sea was calm enough to reduce the white water that often revealed icebergs at a distance. The night was clear but moonless, limiting visual contrast between the horizon and the ice ahead. Even experienced lookouts were working against conditions that removed many of the natural warning signs sailors depended upon. This explanation is strongly supported by contemporary testimony and by modern studies of visibility, yet it does not fully explain why the ship remained vulnerable after the collision occurred. A second explanation examines human decisions. Investigators have long studied the vessel's speed, the handling of ice warnings, the response on the bridge, the early loading of lifeboats, and the communication between officers during the evacuation. Some of these decisions have been criticized in hindsight, while others appear reasonable when viewed within the information available at the time. That distinction matters. Historical investigation is not about judging the past through the certainty of the present. It is about understanding how intelligent people made choices under conditions of uncertainty. The available evidence suggests that no single decision guaranteed the outcome, but several decisions influenced how events unfolded once the emergency had begun. A third explanation looks beyond individuals and toward the systems surrounding them. Maritime regulations at the time reflected decades of previous experience rather than the realities of increasingly larger passenger ships. Lifeboat requirements were based on outdated standards. Wireless communication had become an essential tool, yet procedures for continuous monitoring and emergency coordination were still evolving. Even the ship's celebrated engineering reflected design assumptions that appeared sound until they encountered circumstances beyond those assumptions. None of these systems failed in isolation. Together they created a situation in which several manageable problems combined into one overwhelming crisis. Modern engineering analyses reinforce this broader interpretation. They suggest that the disaster emerged from the interaction of environmental conditions, structural limitations, operational decisions, communication practices, and the physical realities of a vessel moving at high speed through freezing waters. Remove almost any one element from that chain, and history might have unfolded differently. Change the visibility, alter the damage pattern, improve evacuation timing, increase rescue capacity, or revise safety regulations before the voyage, and the final outcome may not have been the same. That does not mean the tragedy was inevitable, nor does it mean it can be reduced to a single cause. It means history often unfolds through the convergence of multiple ordinary factors rather than one extraordinary event. This conclusion is perhaps less satisfying than identifying one clear answer, but it is far more consistent with the evidence. The closer we examine the surviving records, the less this story resembles a simple accident and the more it resembles a chain in which every link mattered. Yet even after reconstructing that chain with remarkable precision, one final question remains. Evidence can explain how the disaster unfolded, but can it ever fully recover what the people aboard experienced during the final moments before the Atlantic closed over the last visible lights? When all of the surviving evidence is placed side by side, a remarkably consistent picture begins to emerge. The disaster was not the inevitable consequence of one iceberg, one captain, one design flaw, or one missed opportunity. Instead, it was the result of several independent systems reaching their limits at the same time. Nature created the conditions. Engineering defined the margins of survival. Human judgment operated within incomplete information. Communication connected ships across the ocean but could not eliminate distance. Rescue efforts began as quickly as circumstances allowed, yet the Atlantic remained vast enough to make every passing minute matter. This broader perspective has gradually replaced many of the simpler explanations that dominated public discussion for decades. Modern expeditions to the wreck, engineering simulations, and careful comparisons of survivor testimony have strengthened the understanding that the event cannot be reduced to a single cause without ignoring important evidence. The collision initiated the crisis, but the scale of the loss emerged from the interaction of everything that followed. This distinction is essential because it changes the lesson history offers. It is tempting to search for one decisive error because simple answers provide emotional closure. Real investigations rarely end that way. They reveal how ordinary decisions, each understandable within its own context, can combine into consequences that no individual intended and few could foresee. That pattern extends far beyond one night in the North Atlantic. It appears repeatedly throughout history whenever confidence in complex systems exceeds the ability to imagine how those systems might fail together. The ship itself reflected the optimism of an era shaped by industrial progress. Advances in engineering had transformed transportation, communication, and manufacturing within a single generation. Larger ships crossed the Atlantic with increasing regularity, wireless technology connected vessels across hundreds of miles, and modern construction techniques inspired confidence that humanity had entered a new age of mastery over distance and nature. None of those achievements were illusions. They were genuine accomplishments. Yet the events of that April night demonstrated that progress does not eliminate uncertainty. It changes the form uncertainty takes. The evidence suggests that everyone involved acted within a world that still contained unknowns beyond calculation. The lookouts searched the darkness with the tools available to them. Officers responded to an unexpected emergency within seconds. Engineers relied on principles that had proven reliable under previous conditions. Wireless operators transmitted every distress signal they could. Rescue crews pushed their ships through dangerous waters toward people they had never met. Seen individually, these actions reveal professionalism, effort, and responsibility far more often than recklessness. Seen collectively, they reveal the limits of even the best intentions when confronted by a chain of events unfolding faster than complete understanding. That may be the most enduring lesson preserved by the historical record. Great disasters often resist simple narratives because reality itself is rarely simple. Every new generation returns to this story hoping to discover one overlooked secret capable of explaining everything. Instead, each careful investigation uncovers something more valuable. It reveals how evidence can replace assumption without removing mystery entirely. We now understand far more about the engineering, the timeline, the communication, and the rescue effort than investigators could have imagined in 1912. Even so, complete certainty remains beyond reach. There are conversations that were never recorded, private thoughts that were never written down, and individual experiences that disappeared with the people who lived them. Those silences are not failures of history. They are reminders that every historical reconstruction, no matter how carefully assembled, is ultimately limited by the evidence that survives. That is why the final chapter of this investigation is not about discovering one last hidden explanation. It is about understanding the difference between what history can confidently tell us and what the Atlantic will always keep for itself. When the last visible lights disappeared beneath the surface at approximately 2:20 in the morning, the event itself came to an end. The investigation, however, had only begun. In the days that followed, survivors carried with them hundreds of personal memories, official inquiries collected testimony from officers, crew members, and passengers, engineers examined technical evidence, and governments introduced sweeping changes to maritime safety. Piece by piece, a clearer understanding of that night emerged. Today, we can say certain things with a high degree of confidence because they are supported by multiple independent sources. We know the ship struck an iceberg after a series of ice warnings had been received throughout the day. We know the damage extended across enough forward compartments to exceed the vessel's design limits. We know that distress calls were transmitted, that rescue ships responded as quickly as distance allowed, and that the evacuation unfolded under conditions of growing urgency as the ship gradually settled lower into the Atlantic. These conclusions are not matters of legend. They are supported by official investigations, survivor testimony, engineering analysis, and decades of research. Beyond those established facts lies another level of understanding. The available evidence strongly suggests that no single cause can adequately explain why the disaster became so devastating. The collision began the sequence, but engineering limitations, environmental conditions, communication practices, evacuation challenges, and the realities of long-distance rescue all influenced the final outcome. Remove one element from that chain, and history might have unfolded differently. That interpretation reflects the broad consensus reached through modern historical and technical analysis. Yet responsible investigation also requires acknowledging what remains beyond our reach. We do not possess a complete record of every conversation that took place on the bridge during the critical moments. We cannot know every thought held by the officers making decisions under extraordinary pressure. We cannot reconstruct every individual experience from passengers whose voices were never preserved. Even survivor testimony, invaluable as it is, contains differences that are entirely understandable when memories are formed during confusion, darkness, and emotional stress. Those uncertainties do not weaken the historical record. They remind us that evidence always has limits, and honest investigation respects those limits instead of pretending certainty where none exists. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate more than a century later. It is not simply because a famous ship was lost. It is because the event forces us to confront an enduring truth about history itself. Human beings often search for one decisive answer, one mistake, or one hidden secret that explains everything. Reality is usually more complicated. The greatest events are often shaped by the convergence of many ordinary factors that only become visible when viewed together. That night in the North Atlantic was not defined by a single failure. It was defined by a chain of circumstances in which nature, technology, experience, confidence, and chance intersected within the span of just a few hours. The ocean preserved the physical evidence well enough for investigators to reconstruct much of what happened, but it could never preserve every human experience carried into that darkness. Some questions have been answered with remarkable precision. Others remain open, not because history has failed, but because the evidence has reached its natural boundary. In the end, perhaps the most honest answer is also the simplest one. We now understand far more about that night than the world once did, yet the complete story will never belong entirely to historians, engineers, or investigators. Part of it still rests beneath the Atlantic, where the silence between documented facts continues to remind us that history is not only about finding answers. It is also about recognizing the value of the questions that remain.